Greetings everyone and welcome to No BS Baking. Got JP here, and today I want to talk a little bit about blogs, recipe sites, and online support. Now, I spent the last little while cruising some well-known baking blogs and recipe providers to really sink my teeth into what's going on out there. Although not really surprised, I found some things that I wanted to bring to your attention. All in the spirit of the name I chose for my channel. So without further delay, let's just get into it. Now, one blog I like to cruise through has photos like this coming up every day without fail. Bakers struggling with recipes or processes with the hopes of getting sound advice from folks that hang in these communities. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some very knowledgeable people out there. More so, there are those that just aren't. Now, it's amazing some of the comments and recommendations you find in places like this. When it comes to advice, be open-minded but cautious. There's a lot of baking folks in those blogs that just love to hand out recommendations that can make things more problematic. There's a lot of information out there that's parroted, some based in fact but missing key information, and then there's the utter nonsense. Now, there's going to be those that disagree. However, I do not believe in feeling my way through a recipe. If the recipe is balanced, feeling becomes more of a physical confirmation of the recipe and its process, not as a I think it needs more of this or that. If your dough feels stiff or soft, you need to adjust it on the fly. Then you need to go back to the recipe because something is not in balance. This one I see all the time. If the baking trolls in these blogs are not just making nonsensical recommendations based on a photo, sometimes they surprise me and ask for a recipe so they can evaluate it. Now, from my personal experience, 9 times out of 10, they look at the recipe in cups and teaspoons and have no clue really how to evaluate it, ultimately providing the person with a blind recommendation based on who knows what. Now, the amount of issues I see online with actual recipes is alarming. So many people struggling with poorly put together, unbalanced recipes that often end in disaster. Now, the online community knows this. Unfortunately, because they're unable or unwilling to correct the recipe, they often make it and it fails. Then they just move on. Now, one place I hear about and see referenced a lot as a go-to place above all others for recipes that seemingly work almost every time, well, that site is Sally's Baking Addiction. She has a nicely constructed site with tons of recipes that seemingly turn out well for most users, and her reviews, they're solid. Putting all that aside, actually finding a working recipe is one thing. Yet one of the most common questions I see is how do I scale my recipe? Or how do I make the recipe work in a different size or shaped pan? Especially when it comes to cakes and cookie and muffin style products, and variations of these. Now, for these types of items, it should be easy, right? They're all based on ratios. Well, from what I've seen, the golden ratios that we all think about are more often than not modified, and often to a point where you can't even really see the ratio relationship anymore, especially if not presented in percent. Now, the old 1, 2, 3, 4 cakes have been altered to become a 1 cup, 2 cup, and 3 cup cake with 4 eggs. Well, in theory, anyway. So many cake recipes have strayed so far from the golden ratios, for better and for worse, that keeping them balanced for scaling is almost impossible without a little math. I know I'm straying a bit from breads into cakes and the like. However, through my blog cruising, I noted a real need for a tool that would help home bakers sort out these problems as well. So as I was reworking all the recipe builders for breads, gluten-free breads, and pre-ferment style products that are included now, I thought it might be a great idea to build a recipe builder to sort out cakes, cookies, and muffins. So to keep things on track, I started with a recipe from Sally for a 3-level 6-inch cake. So let's look at what this tool can do. So here I just put in my recipe name and list my ingredients and quantities based on a recipe. All the percentages factor automatically. So now she's asking for egg whites from 3 large eggs, so let's put that in. Now we need to tell the recipe how many units we need. In this instance, we need 3 6-inch cakes. The next step was to get our icing and frosting recipe sorted. I used her vanilla buttercream recipe and listed it here. Now the amount of frosting used is dependent upon the type, personal preference, and creative plans that you may have. Her recipe shows 98% based on cake weight, which you may decide to use, but for this example, I'm going to reduce that amount of frosting to around 60%. I don't want it so thick. Standard bake loss for cakes is around 8 to 15%, being that frosting quantities required have a direct correlation with finished bake weight. I'll opt for a middle-of-the-road 10% bake loss for determining my frosting requirements. This recipe now transfers automatically to the final print template, with the recipe and frosting perfectly balanced and based on my selections. Now, if you could believe it, all the hard work is done, so let's scale this recipe. My daughter's baby is celebrating a birthday, so let's change this into a one-layer personal cake for her to enjoy. A few small inputs in the scale the recipe section. And then telling the recipe that I want to see the scaled version by selecting 2. Everything else I'll leave exactly the same. But hold on, let's turn these into some muffin-style cakes. Now with a working recipe, when it comes to adjusting pan sizes, the sky is the limit. But to keep it simple, let's scale Sally's recipe for a 10-inch round pan from 6. First thing we'll do is determine the amount of batter she's using for her 6-inch recipe. Then we'll add the new pan size and use her exact batter to capacity ratio of 32%. So for each pan we're going to need 823 grams of batter. So now that we know how much batter we need in each pan for our 3-layer cake, plug in the new weights and you're done. Control and working portions of the templates provide detailed information for every step. If you want to really get into understanding your recipe, then there are additional features that can help you not only fine-tune your recipe, but fine-tune your recipe evaluation skills. The gluten-free bread recipe builder is perfect for dialing in these often difficult products, and scaling them has never been easier. In less time than it takes you to input your recipe, you can scale it for any size pan, make minor adjustments, and key in on important ingredient percents that work. Quick, easy, and with step-by-step instructions. All of the recipe templates have been updated for quick recipe evaluation, scaling, and modification. To demonstrate how this works, I asked AI app to give me a recipe for an enriched 50% whole wheat bread, so I could quickly just throw it in as an example. Normally I find recipes from AI pretty solid, But here was an excellent example of how quickly you can run into trouble with recipes if you don't evaluate them. So AI told me this was a 70% hydration dough, which I thought sounded okay. But now that I did the calculations, it's 84%. Not okay. So I adjusted the recipe in the adjustment column. But just being the cheeky guy that I am, I had to ask AI, what's it doing? So even though it apologized and said I was correct, that doesn't help me much if I trusted in the recipe from the onset without seeing things in percent. This most likely would have just ended in a disaster. So to put this all into perspective, everything begins and ends with formulation. If the formula is not sound, there's little chance of sorting things out through processing. Your best baking tool is one that provides you with the knowledge and understanding ingredient percentages, regardless of whether it's bread, cake, cookies, pastry, muffins, or whatever baked goods you want to make. Instead of failing at a recipe and trying another one, as most of these blogs recommend as a solution, learn to understand, fix, and modify recipes methodically and in balance. Now, I've spent many months creating these recipe managers, calculators, and ingredient guides with one goal in mind: help folks bake better, more consistent, and successful every time.